Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Miller. I'm the Education Policy Director at the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Today, I'm excited to welcome James Lindsay. James is a best-selling author, writer, and speaker who focuses primarily upon the various types of critical theory that are threatening society today. In line with this mission, he wrote the book Cynical Theories together with Helen Pluckrose and has created and maintains the site New Discourses. It provides the most comprehensive outsider analysis of critical theories available today. His writing has been translated into more than a dozen languages and increasingly serves as a basis for the pushback against critical theories, incursions into American and Western societies today. So James, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate it.
So I think a good place to start would be the Grievance Studies Affair. This is an event that you're probably the most well known for. So the Grievance Studies Affair happened in 2018. You worked with Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, where basically you guys punked all the academics by writing about 20 fake papers, and they had ridiculous conclusions. So could you explain what this affair entailed and kind of what were the outcomes, what were the ramifications of it?
Yeah, it's actually a really good place to start. I did a talk last night in Virginia about this, and we started with it as well. So it's a really good place to start. The Grievance Studies Affair, like you said, we talked about. We wrote 20 fake academic articles, which, by the way, an academic article is not like a newspaper article, not like a magazine article. Typically, these things might take 6 months to a year for an academic or a group of academics to put together research and write. We wrote 20 of them in 10 months. So what we did was, in the humanities, something akin to most of an academic career at the research level in 10 months. So 20 of them is a lot. 7 of those were accepted for publication. 4 of them actually were published before the time ran out on us. The Wall Street Journal tattled on us to the world in October of 2018. And so we had 3 more that had been accepted. We also had 7 left that were under peer review out of the 20. So how many would have got in had we not been called out is unclear. A sociologist who's not us guessed 11 of the 20 would have been accepted. So this showed that whatever it was we were doing with our so-called ridiculous or horrifying or whatever papers is acceptable to the disciplines that we were targeting, which are like gender studies, critical race theory, sexuality studies, fat studies, disability studies, and so on. All of these kind of critical studies of identity is what we were kind of targeting, broadly speaking. So what we were doing was acceptable, and what we were doing, therefore, becomes very pertinent to the discussion. And what we were doing was, in fact, creating what might be called sophistry. We were starting with our conclusions. You said that the papers had ridiculous conclusions. Well, that's where we started. So we started with our conclusions and then made the academic literature get us there. So we would figure out something we wanted to forward, like that men should be trained like dogs in order to combat rape culture, or that Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he organizes the underlying call for the Nazi Party, is a good intersectional feminist model. And we then built the papers around those arguments and then produce those arguments, in order to get to the conclusion. So this is not actually doing research. This isn't actually trying to understand things. This is, we came up with some ridiculous activist-driven conclusion if we were actually activists, and then we worked our way there. And so what we showed, in a sense, was that the basis for all of this, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's critical gender studies, whether it's any of these kinds of things that are so prominent in society today, the academic basis where they say, oh, race researchers, this or that, gender researchers, this or that there is no actual academic basis. You can literally make it up. You can literally start with your conclusion and work backwards. So there is no actual foundation under any of this. So when they appeal to scholars, they appeal to studies, they go on CNN and they throw somebody up and say, oh, this is one of the foremost scholars on critical race theory, they might as well be making it up. Because while they are genuinely saying what's in the field is just based on kind of self-referential, not even research, but it's kind of self-referential cycle where somebody wrote a paper that's largely, they started with their conclusion and worked their way there. And then somebody cited that paper with their conclusion that they worked their way to. And all of a sudden it looks like there's the illusion that there's this body of research extending back 50 years or 30 years or 40 years, depending on the discipline. And it's actually all just kind of conjured out of the air like a magic spell.
So can you explain a little bit more one of these examples? For example, the dog park paper, I think is hilarious. I really want people to grasp how ridiculous some of these things are and how insane it is that an academic journal would accept these papers.
Yeah, so the paper by far that got the most attention is about the dog park. That's where we started with the idea, and this was very early on in the project. We started with this crazy idea that maybe we should train men the way that we train dogs in order to combat rape culture. So if you could, the original idea was maybe if we could just find a dog training manual and talk about how dogs are actually trained, and then say we should do this to men, and then cite the dog manual, that would, be just, that's a way to go. And then we tried to figure out a proper dog training manual, and we couldn't, but we said we needed to ground it in something real. So we said, Pete has a couple of dogs, and I said, Pete, just exaggerate some stuff that happens at the dog park and say this is why it's necessary and how we know what we know. And so he wrote this ridiculous draft, and when we started working on it, making it more ridiculous but also more acceptable, and finally wrote this paper where we claimed that we spent 1,000 hours as one person in a dog park in Portland, Oregon over the course of 1 year, never in the heavy rain. And I know. And then we examined, we documented tons and tons, thousands of dog humping incidents, as we phrase them in the paper, and dog fights and things like this, and how people reacted to them. So we claimed that we documented over 10,000 of these things, and then we said that we examined the genitals of the dogs, slightly fewer than 10,000 dogs, in fact, and then interrogated their owners about their sexual orientations. And we documented the ways that they would interact, their human companions of the dogs. That's how we always phrased it, how the human companions of the dogs would interact and intervene if there were dog fights, or, as we said, dog humping incidents. And tried to document it kind of like an implicit bias test. Are male and female dog owners, straight and gay dog owners, are they more upset if there's straight versus gay dog sex? Which one bothers them more and why? And then we just make this leap from there and say that urban dog parks are petri dishes for canine rape culture, which immediately analogizes to human rape culture via the idea of like nightclubs, which are obviously rape condoning spaces, just like dog parks are rape condoning spaces. And from there, we applied a lens, we said, of Black feminist criminology, which we just pulled out of the air, and cited a paper and said that this therefore leads to the conclusion that if it were politically feasible, we should train men the way that we train dogs, like putting them in leashes, using shock collars, etc., to get men to desist from rape culture and the attitudes that lead to rape culture. And this is the indicative, and just to make another point actually about how indicative of how crazy these papers that we wrote were in some cases. We, in that paper, actually included a bunch of just nonsense data, if you would, that doesn't even need to be there. Like, we documented other instances of dog misbehavior, like dogs going to the bathroom on each other, people breaking up dog fights by throwing logs and bricks at dogs, and singing at the dogs, running over to their dog and immediately doing jumping jacks and push-ups next to their dog. These are things that we actually wrote in the paper. And this paper wasn't just accepted by this journal, which at the time, this is a few years ago now, but at the time was 25 years old and celebrating its 25th anniversary. It was ranked very highly on all of the different journal rating systems, both in gender studies and in feminist geography. It was the leading feminist geography journal, as a matter of fact. It was accepted and given pride of place. It was awarded for excellence, and it was going to be held up as an exemplary piece of scholarship in feminist geography. So they didn't just accept it; they actually honored it as excellence. And it was patently absurd, and it had a research methodology that didn't make any sense, could not possibly have been true. It used an analytical tool that didn't make any sense at all. It then made the outlandish claim that we should train men the way we train dogs, including leashes and shock collars, if only it were politically feasible.
Man, so all of this comes down to basically the process of idea laundering, right? So
yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to specifically what idea laundering is, how it really developed in academia, why this is such a crisis?
Yeah, so our friend Brett Weinstein named the term idea laundering. We actually showed Brett, we went to Brett's house and showed him what we had done about 3 days before the public found out. And Brett immediately seized on the idea that this is the ideas or concepts equivalent of money laundering. So in money laundering, you have, somebody does some illegal thing, they make a lot of money, and they come up with all these kind of like legal pathways where that money gets put back into the world and comes back to them, so that it looks clean, because now there's a paper trail justifying, like maybe they make a fake laundromat, maybe laundering, maybe they do any kinds of legal activities, however, that make it so that the money comes back and there's a paper trail and it looks like it was got legally. And so Brett's concept of idea laundering was that you have people who are basically making up the conclusions that they want to forward, and then they're getting them accepted by the kinds of avenues of cultural production that have a lot of respect, that drive an idea into the public. And so with academia, the biggest center of idea generation is in fact the academic journals. In fact, it's the highest level in our society. So by creating academic journals that will accept this kind of sophistry, what you end up with is a possibility to create the appearance, like I was just saying, of academic rigor and academic chops behind something that's not real. So these ideas get laundered into respectability and being taken seriously, and even by a lot of corners who don't get deeply into what the peer-reviewed literature breaks down as, would say it's science. There's a scholar, there's a study, scientific studies have shown, these kinds of phrases can then be attached, and they have citations, citation chains going back, sometimes, like I said, 50 years at this point, backing all this up. So it looks all legitimate and is not legitimate. So thus the laundering. I tried to argue at the time and nobody really believed me, but I think people will believe me now that the media does this as well. Wikipedia does this as well. There's an entire activist branch on Wikipedia that idea launders, that people write some grubby article, somebody cites a grubby article and another grubby article. Wikipedia considers that an authoritative source, and all of a sudden some salacious thing about you is in your Wikipedia entry as a result, and you can't refute it because you are not considered an authoritative source on yourself, for example. So Wikipedia activism takes place in this way. This is another form of idea laundering. CNN fake news, as it's been called by somebody or another, is also idea laundering, where they take an idea and they're going to promote it in a particular way. We used to call that propaganda, but the means by which an idea is made to seem legitimate through endless repetition on the news and increasingly authoritative sources, including at this point like the New York Times, that have huge amounts of kind of imprimatur behind them. Those things are also mechanisms by which ideas can be laundered into respectability that they don't actually deserve. So those are three domains, but I think the academic domain is the most concerning, because that's sort of where we really believe knowledge is produced and stored in our society. Like the highest quality knowledge is in the academic literature. So it's really concerning that I think what we did is exposed that this is occurring. And it's really concerning that the response has been that somehow we're bad people, or that this problem's not really happening, or this problem is happening, but it's so fringe that it doesn't matter, even while literally we're seeing these ideas quoted on television. For example, Cheryl Harris's idea that whiteness is property, to justify the burning down of buildings and stores and targets and looting and all of this stuff that was going on last summer. So it seems a little preposterous to me that, this idea laundered concept that whiteness is property is somehow irrelevant, and somehow is the justification given on CNN and MSNBC for why buildings are on fire, and we have to just tolerate this. This is kind of that propaganda idea laundered space that we have to now occupy, because this has been allowed to occur for so long.
Right. And of course you guys aren't bad people. This is complete propaganda that these people are pushing, and you guys are simply trying to expose the truth. And you did. The humiliation should be on these journals, the fact that they've allowed this to continue, the fact that they think this is serious scholarship when it's not, right? So one term that you talk about a lot, you've written about a lot in New Discourses in your book, Critical Theories, is the term critical social justice. Can you define this term maybe in layman's terms for us?
Yeah, so critical social justice is actually a term I borrowed from a very famous purveyor of these kinds of this worldview, really. And it's kind of a catch-all term that kind of captures all of these different critical theories of identity. Like critical race theory is one, queer theory is one, gender studies is one, disability studies, fat studies, sexuality studies, and we can just go on down the list of however many we want to make up today. We could probably come up with specifically autistic studies and deaf autistic studies as subsets of disability studies. There's one called CRIP theory, that's short for cripple theory. I'm not making that up, which is queer theory applied to disability. There's all kinds of these things. And so critical social justice is a term that I borrowed from Robin DiAngelo. So I figured, well, if they themselves call it this, it's probably an okay term to use. And in the book, it's called Is Everyone Really Equal, is the title of the book where I first encountered the term critical social justice. She says that we're going to call this worldview that they're proceeding from, the set of assumptions, critical social justice, because she wants to distinguish. She said many scholars just use the term social justice to try to reclaim its true commitments. this is pretty close to a quote, paraphrasing closely, but we're going to use the term critical social justice so that we can be sure that what we're doing is something different. And then she says what that different thing is that it's rooted in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, derives from the critiques given from postmodern theory. And so what they're using is a very specific method to approach the concept of social justice, which they define as the attempt to achieve group rights as opposed to individual rights, which of course is a nonsense thing to even think about. Groups don't have agency because they're not individuals, they're groups. They're statistical objects, they are not people. So they have this agenda to look at groups statistically, figure out how groups are behaving or performing differently statistically, and under certain circumstances to decide that this must be some form of bigotry that's causing the problem, whether that's systemic racism, systemic sexism, or misogyny, systemic heteronormativity, or cisnormativity, or ableism, or disableism, or fat phobia. Again, the list goes as long as you want it to go. There's some system of power that's excluding people at the group level or excluding groups from equal outcomes. And so we have to start adjusting the system to make it so that the groups get equal outcome. And the tool that we're going to use to do that is called critical theory. So critical social justice, you could say, you know, whatever you think about the concept of social justice, maybe you don't like their definition and you think that, well, a more fair society, that qualifies too, and maybe we're for that. And whatever you want to say, critical social justice has a very particular set of commitments. Its own architects, in their own words, say it has particular commitments that are different from the usual or traditional or true even commitments. That was the exact wording in the book, the true commitments of social justice. So it's some very specific project, and it's kind of a catch-all term that captures all of these critical theories of identity. If you want to get academic about it, which I don't think you do, but technically what it is it's called critical constructivism, which is the combination of critical theory with social constructivism. In other words, a combination of neo-Marxism and postmodernism, which is, when you held up cynical theories, the thesis statement of that book essentially is that postmodernism didn't vanish in society. It fused with critical theory in the 1980s and 1990s and became a new thing. And that new thing is technically critical constructivism, and the kind of, I guess, easygoing term for that would be critical social justice. I was going to say the slang or hip term, but that's woke, and they all technically mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media and in the public lately about critical race theory. Can you explain how that relates to critical social justice a little more in depth, why that's such an important piece of this, but how, you know, critical race theory is kind of just the leading edge of the social justice agenda? Is that correct?
Yeah. Critical race theory is the one that took root most effectively in the United States. And it's been known, the Communist Party USA was saying back in the 1930s and 40s that race was going to be the weak spot where they would be able to break into the United States. And so I bring up Communist Party because, like I said, this is rooted in neo-Marxism, and those people were ultimately communists. It's rooted also in postmodernism, and the postmodernists were kind of despairing post-communists. They no longer believed in communism, but their inclinations pointed in that direction. And so we certainly have this long-standing project, you know, going back close to 100 years now, to figure out how to utilize race in order to open up the United States to something like a Marxist-style revolution at the cultural level. And critical race theory is the tool that was developed to do it. Now, critical race theory itself developed very specifically first, it had two kind of phases of its development. In the 1970s, it developed into the 1980s under a man named Derek Bell, first African-American tenured professor at Harvard Law, who was doing what was called critical legal studies. So it had a very materialist dimension, and that materialism is the same materialism in Marx's dialectical materialism. And therefore, we're still talking about something very Marxist in organization, but it's about law, it's about the material structures of society, it's about economics, etc. And so he develops it kind of in this one way. It's very cynical, it's very pessimistic. He has this kind of thesis that, you know, everything that happened within the civil rights movement was in fact a way to cheat African Americans in particular, or people of color more broadly. The white people rigged it up to their own advantage when they didn't have to. They could have done it out of the goodness of their heart, but instead they had their own cynical motivations, and they created a raft of new problems. He was very cynical about Brown versus Board of Education, for example. He thought that created just new problems by desegregating schools, that poisoned the disadvantaged blacks even further. If you look at some of the stuff that Johnson put in under the Great Society, I think Bell had some points, but I think approached them in a very cynical and inappropriately nasty way. All that said, There was a second phase that developed going from the 80s and the 90s by his student, Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw was a black feminist. So black feminism becomes very important. Black feminism has deeper roots that point back into the neo-Marxist school and had picked up some of the postmodern theory as feminists were wont to do. But a kind of chain that you can see is Herbert Marcuse was a very influential radical neo-Marxist in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And I mean, he wrote a book in 1964 called One Dimensional Man that sold over 300,000 copies that year. That's a lot of copies of a book. And very influential guy, kind of the architect of the new left, as it was called, which is the old left was communism, Marxism, which had lost favor looking at what happened in the Soviet Union after Khrushchev told on them. And so now you have this new left that's very liberation oriented, and that was Marcuse's doing primarily. And he had a student named Angela Davis, who's still working today in prison and police abolition. And she was a very active black feminist, and her black feminism was very influential. I don't want to say that it's all her, but there's this whole movement of kind of black feminism and black radicalism that was going along with, and feminist radicalism that was going along with this development of the new left. And that became kind of the stew pot in which Kimberly Crenshaw came out and then fused Derek Bell's ideas about law and legal theory and race into this new thing, which she called, he did not call, but she called critical race theory. So we could talk in depth about what critical race theory is, but that's where it comes from. It is, in essence, the shortest way to put it is that just like Marx believed that there's a capitalist superstructure that controlled everything and kept the proletariat down, critical race theory begins with the assumption that there's a white supremacist superstructure that controls everything and keeps people of color, especially black people, down to the benefit of whites. That racism is the ordinary state of affairs of society because it's been organized with this kind of Marxian superstructure of white supremacy, and that people who are empowered to figure out how that works are called critical race theorists. They're able to see that invisible racism or that hidden racism or even the overt racism. Because Derek Bell believed, for example, that racism doesn't actually get better, it just hides itself more successfully. So racism in a sense doesn't get better with time. There's no progress. It only gets worse because it's the same but hides itself more successfully. And critical race theory is the basically set of magic seeing goggles that allow people who are trained in it properly and have what's called a critical race consciousness to be able to see it and identify it and call it out. Now, critical race consciousness is a derivation in the racial dimension of what's called critical consciousness, which is what the neo-Marxists called, or switched into, I should say, out of what Marx called class consciousness. So you have the exact same architecture going on, which is why when people in the political realm say it's a Marxist theory, they're right except for a tiny suffix. It's Marxian, it's not Marxist, but it's distinction really without much difference. Economics versus racial culture.
So you mentioned communism. Do you think that communism is the end goal of critical theorists? Is there an end goal? What do you think it is?
Well, I mean, they tell us all the time what they want, but there is, yes. They tell us all the time that they want equity. So equity becomes the end goal, racial equity and racial justice. So this can be understood in terms of communism, but it's better to be understood that this communism had already kind of given way to that liberationist vision. And Herbert Marcuse, who I named a minute ago, in 1969 wrote an essay that he titled An Essay on Liberation. And in that essay, he actually defines liberation as socialism without the bureaucracy. So yes, except not all the ones that, real communism hasn't been tried. It has to be kind of applied here. So racial justice will occur if and only if we've entered into this kind of post-racial situation where the critical race theorists have brought up all of the racial problems, exposed the superstructure, and replaced it with a new power dynamic that remakes the country fundamentally. And the way that you will know that racial justice is occurring is that you have racial equity. And racial equity means that you have approximately identical outcomes across statistical groups, especially when black people are below anybody. So to get to equity, there will be redistributing access, redistributing opportunity, and redistributing resources in a kind of communist way. But because it's so focused on race, it'd be more accurate to call it ethno-communism. There will certainly be this kind of favoritism of haves and have-nots that pure communism would not have ever advocated for. Everybody would have been equal. Communism was workers of the world unite. And in this case, it's going to definitely be historically marginalized groups are going to be elevated.
Okay, so going back to the university for just a minute, in your book, Cynical Theories, you write, there is a problem that begins in our universities, and it comes down to social justice. Can you describe this problem and basically how it's affecting and changing the world? A lot of people think that the ideas on universities are kind of cloistered to a few radical academics. We know this isn't the case. We know it's affecting society. Can you explain that process and sort of what a social justice university is?
Yeah, well, I would say that any institution that's basically tipped over into this way of thinking, like it becomes its dominant mode, it's institutionally installed, so its administration, its fundamental operating system, its mission statements all start to include it, are going to become a social justice, if you will, institution. So if it's a university, when the university mission statement starts looking like we're going to use critical methods, we should capitalize the C, they don't typically, we're going to use critical methods, or we're going to focus on anti-racism or diversity, equity, and inclusion, equity being exactly what we just talked about, are our top priorities. Diversity and inclusion are also Trojan horse terms that mean something very specific in the sense that it means really installing commissars and removing everybody who disagrees. When you have those conditions, you have entered into an institution that has taken this up and could be described as, say, a social justice institution. Another way to phrase it would be that it has Sovietized, but it's kind of this updated neo-Sovietism that's based on identity categories and identity consciousness. So how does this happen? Well, it turns out that the people that do this are activists, so they're very interested in going to meetings, and they show up to meetings, and they tend to be bureaucrats, and they tend to like to install community guidelines, community standards along these ideas of things like, justice as they define it, or equity, or diversity, or inclusion, or whatever you want to talk about. And so because these are people who very disproportionately want to go to meetings and very disproportionately want to install community guidelines, the way that this actually tends to spread is that people like that show up to all the meetings where most people don't want to go. You can imagine a faculty meeting open to all faculty, 60 people show up. If 45 of them are in on this, into this, then it's probably just going to start bending everything in that direction. And 60 and 45 is pretty generous. It's probably going to be more like 16 show up. And 15 of them actually are into it, because that's who shows up to the meetings, are people who want to change things. As Marx put it, of course, though, the hitherto philosophers have studied the world to understand it. The point is to change it. So that's kind of what these things would look like. It's not correct, though, to say that they're indoctrination mills. My friend Pete likes to call them indoctrination mills kind of constantly. They are, in fact, reprogramming centers. It's much worse than indoctrination. It is programming. It's cult programming. It is teaching people not to think according to a certain doctrine, but rather to see the world in a certain way. And it's a very important distinction, because with the doctrine, all you can do is kind of repeat the doctrine. And you just kind of, fall back on a very kind of Jesus take the wheel, simplistic sort of, to use a metaphor, if you will, or analogy, way of thinking. With reprogramming, it's a completely different thing. And these are people who are going to go see those problems everywhere. They're going to be awakened to a consciousness. And that consciousness is, in fact, a cult consciousness that, in this case, with critical race theory, is racist. Or if it happens to be with something to do with the, if it's gender, it's going to be bringing up all of those problems. If it's trans, it's going to bring up all of those problems. Like, you can see that clearly the feminists have lost control of their gender critical program, and now they have to face rampant misogyny from biological men who are using their gender theory against them in a way that they have no defense against. So the underlying thing, though, with the social justice is that social justice is being used as a moral cover to justify being able to do this. So they'll say, oh, this is to create social justice for all these marginalized groups who have the backing of all of Hollywood, all of big corporations, all of the media, most of the Democratic Party, half of the Republicans, probably most of the government, very marginalized people who can get away with burning down buildings and have the vice president who to be come out and say, let's bail them out of jail. Very marginalized people, as you can tell. So, but this is the grift, and it's to hide behind this moral cover of creating a more fair society, when what they really want is to empower and enrich people such as themselves, who have the right ideology, who have this consciousness that they're then going to use to program other people.
So in Idaho, we produced a couple of reports that examined our two flagship universities, University of Idaho and Boise State. And what we did is we examined every level of the university. We looked at administration, we looked at hiring, the policies, looked at curriculum, and where students live and sleep, just student life in general. and basically found that these universities were dedicated to social justice on every single level. In your opinion, if a university is systemically controlled by social justice, do you think that they can fulfill their core missions?
Absolutely not. No. Social justice and academic rigor are orthogonal at best. In other words, they point in different directions. I'm trying to think of what it struck like jumped to mind. I'm trying to remember what I saw the other day where I think it was in the military. It was in the Navy. Okay. So the Navy put out a memo saying that they're going to go into this kind of social justice direction, social justice Navy, instead of social justice university now. Don't be uncomfortable or anything. And one of the things that they said is that they were going to do this, and then they had to add in a clause without compromising merit. So merit is actually, you're already introducing a second variable into how you're going to do the analysis of what's going on. A good example of where that's come up is at Berkeley, which is, a bastion of conservative values, as you will. Berkeley had a few years ago in 2000, it was either 17 or 19. There's a 2-year gap between these. I think it was in 17. They came out and they said that they were going to have diversity statements, and they had a rubric that they published of how they would be graded. And to say, oh, I think everybody's equal, that would get you a 1. And then to go into the whole critical race theory view, that'll get you a 5. So they gave you your diversity statement score, and they said that, well, this isn't going to be used as a hiring criterion. And everybody was like, yeah, right. And so then a couple of years later, it comes out that in their biology department, which is a science, as you'll notice, they actually use these diversity statements to exclude 76% of applicants without ever looking at their resumes, without looking at their CVs. So 76% of applicants weren't even assessed to see if they were qualified or not. They were just graded off of their diversity statement. So this already means that that odds have been raised, right? The missions are at odds with one another, and this has come up because now we're no longer looking at merit. Becomes at best a secondary consideration against if it's happening after the diversity analysis. Merit becomes at best a secondary consideration. So if your goal as a university is to have, say, the best biologists that you can hire and the best biology instructors that you can hire, and you're actually eliminating 3/4 of the applicants based upon some exogenous criterion about their commitment to diversity, for example, then you already have, like I said, orthogonal commitments happening. And it turns out that being an expert in diversity, as I think I proved, isn't that hard. It's basically just knowing how to say the right things and avoiding certain things that are off limits, and playing this kind of political status game, and mouthing all the right jargon at the right times. It's not at all committed to the goal of teaching people things or understanding things deeply. It's a different political project. So you contaminate or pollute or corrupt the system with that. And then, like I said, the goal of the university should actually be teaching people what to think, or not what to think, but how to think. And when you start telling them that they're going to think in a very particular way, that there's only one correct how to think, that's critical consciousness, and that there are certain right and wrong things to think in that regard, and there's your teaching people how to think, or I'm sorry, what to think. I've got this all messed up. Then you've definitely diverted from the mission of the university. You're not teaching people to engage in genuine research. You're not teaching people to engage in open-ended inquiry to find out the truth. You're not teaching them to question, say, official dogma or doctrine. You're now teaching them to participate in it and telling them that, there's something deeply morally and epistemologically wrong with them if they don't. And so it completely diverts the mission. In fact, what it does, we saw, if you want to see what it does in practice, just go read the history of what Mao Zedong did to the universities in China. After at first he got rid of the standardized tests. Imagine that we're doing that now. Wonder why. He got rid of the standardized tests so that people that had party loyalty could be advanced to positions. Then they taught Marxist-Leninist doctrine of the Mao with Chinese characteristics, as Mao phrased it, in the universities, and those people became commissars and apparatchiks throughout the society that advanced Maoist, which is ultimately Marxist ideology. And what you'll see is that the same thing is going to happen here. The universities will no longer be places of research or learning. They're going to increasingly become places where this programming takes place, and that the only people who are able to get in and get credentialed by them are going to be increasingly people who are able to write the best diversity statements, whether that's to be a student or whether to work at them, as opposed to people who are getting in based on merit. And then, of course, it'll just pollute every single discipline as well. Every single class, mathematics, physics, whatever, is all going to have to touch on how it's relevant to social justice and how critical analysis of society. So ultimately, like, this one kind of corrupt approach to sociology becomes the only real subject that's taught. And you see this already in our K through 12 schools, just to the west of you all. Oregon and Washington have done this. California is doing it as well. The entire western seaboard of the U.S. has now taken up this new education where even math has to be reorganized to basically focus on critical sociology, and using math or science or whatever as the proxy to teach that. So everything becomes about the programming. It's totally, I mean, orthogonal is a really nice way to say that it actually completely subverts the point of the university and turns it into a party apparatus.
So you mentioned sociology just as an example. So obviously sociology could be done under like a traditional understanding. It could be a serious field. It could also be overtaken by critical theory, like you mentioned. So to the extent there are fields like sociology or English or history that are overtaken by critical theory at a university, say a public university, do you think that it is beneficial for the public to fund that program at that university if it is completely dominated by critical methods?
No. I don't think so. I don't think the public should be funding this any more than I think the public should be funding Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Scientology. Scientology, it actually has shocking parallels to. I don't think that it's in the public's interest to be pushing something that teaches a particular answer about what somebody's conscience should contain. I don't think it's not even actually teaching rigorous things. So I don't think that I don't actually think it should be funded. I think that taxpayer money should not be directed toward ideological programming in any regard whatsoever. And I don't care what the ideology is, whether it's an ideology I support, whether it's an ideology I don't support, especially at the university level. You really should be training mature thinkers at that point, who are able to grapple with ideologies and other lines of thought without being kind of shoved into these very simplistic boxes that this is the one right answer. Private schools can more or less do what they want, but to the degree that they're taking state or federal dollars, I think that no state and federal dollars should be going to these kinds of projects whatsoever.
So you mentioned a really interesting idea, which is that we shouldn't fund these the same way we shouldn't fund a religion. And you've written a lot of interesting things about how anti-racism is like a cult. It's like a cult religion. Could you speak to that a little bit about how it really does kind of have a cult creed and it manifests as that?
Well, sure. I mean, anything where you have the fundamental underlying premise is that you have to develop a certain kind of consciousness or you're not doing it right. You don't have authentic engagement without a proper consciousness. That's a cult. That's pretty much by definition a cult. You have to have been brought into the cult way of thinking. It in an extreme form, if you wanted to switch over to something like Christianity, it would be like saying that somebody who's not a Christian cannot read the scripture and understand it unless they first accept, Jesus. And if that were a precondition, then I think that's kind of very cultish as well, because it makes it so that only, kind of Gnostic, blessed or, eyes opened insiders have the correct interpretation, and everybody else is not going to be allowed to understand it or to comment upon it. And I think that that's a trait that we see here. In fact, I know it's a trait that we see here. Barbara Applebaum in 2010 wrote a book called Being White, Being Good, in which she has a sustained argument that you only have properly engaged with the material if you agree with it. You see this also in several papers. Allison Bailey put out a paper in 2017. It wasn't very highly cited, but it's in Hypatia, which is a very highly regarded journal. And it's called Privilege Preserving Epistemic Pushback is the concept. She's tracking this in the classroom, is what she says, philosophy classrooms. And Privilege Preserving Epistemic Pushback says that if you don't agree with what critical scholars are saying, then it must be that you're pushing back in order to preserve your privilege. All throughout all of this neo-Marxism that we talked about previously, and then going into this new critical social justice ideology, is the idea that if you don't have the awakened consciousness, then you must have false consciousness. You don't really understand the nature of your oppression. You don't really understand the nature of your life. And so only by understanding it the way they tell you have to understand it, is it possible for you to correctly interpret what you see in the world. That's a cult. As far as it being religious, I mean, I don't know that we have time to dive into the full depth of this, but it has a metaphysic, it has a catechism. You see the religious behaviors. I think somebody did a baptism in Arizona iced tea or something like that on the street at the place where George Floyd died or something like this. I mean, it's got all these kind of external trappings of religion. If you read Robin DiAngelo's book White Fragility and you are familiar with what the Puritan humiliations look like, you can tell that she's writing a Puritan humiliation in a faith where she knows that racism is bad, and so she's been saved from racism, but because she's not certain of her salvation, she's writing a humiliation, which is exactly what the Puritans were doing. So it's a very puritanical strain is going on within this as well. But ultimately, the metaphysics comes back to a philosopher nobody ever talks about, who is Hegel, and Hegel laid out this kind of dialectical process, and so their faith and their catechism really follow the Hegelian dialectical model, so much so that, for example, there's this passage in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which is a modern contemporary book, where they describe how things work, and at the end of the paragraph within Critical Race Theory, at the end of the paragraph they say, and so the dialectic progresses. Well, the Hegelian faith is based on the idea that the dialectic progresses by the action of activists taking it up, and that leads for Hegel to a place where the ideas become perfect, the absolute realizes himself as deity, and you enter into a utopian world where everything, the ideas, the state, and the spirit of the world have all become perfected. And that got translated into Marxism in the materialist sense, that the economy and the state perfect themselves, and that's communism. That got translated into neo-Marxism, and that the culture gets itself right, and we enter into a liberated culture, liberationism. And that's what this is all about. And it's ultimately got a very deep religious construct. So it should really be understood as a religion. In my opinion, it should be treated just like any other religion would be treated by the First Amendment, which gives them free exercise, but it also removes them from the direct influence in taxpayer. It can't have any state endorsement, so taxpayers are not funding this, and it should be stripped out of public institutions, including public universities, public schools in particular also, but the military, federal apparatuses, etc.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to take a moment to define 3 words that you've been using a lot, just for our audience to get a better understanding. So a social justice university is dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are very sweet sounding words. A lot of Americans value these words under their original definition, right? But we know that social justice activists are reconceiving of these words. So what do these words now mean? And what do you think American citizens should hear when they hear these words?
All right. So we talked about equity. Equity means, well, the technical definition, equity derives from something called social equity theory, which arose in the 1960s. What a shock. And social equity theory holds that where equality means that citizens A and B are equal, equity means that citizens A and B will have shares distributed so that they are made equal. So it is the redistribution of resources, opportunities, access, etc., so that people will be made equal who are not otherwise equal. That's analyzed at the level of statistical groups under social justice, under social equity theory. So it is the redistribution of resources. So in other words, equity equals communism, sort of. The ethno-communism with historical characteristics, or whatever you want to say. Diversity actually means that you have this, you are of varying different identities, but you have the critical consciousness of that identity that allows you to understand it in the authentic and correct way without false consciousness. So if you are a woman, but you are not enlightened to the ideas of feminism, you don't have a feminist consciousness, then you are not actually authentically expressing the condition of what it's like to be a woman. If you are black, like Kanye West, and you put on a Make America Great Again hat and you say, I think for myself, Ta-Nehisi Coates is going to write about you in the Atlantic 2 days later, he's not black anymore. And we've seen this from other people as well, or we've seen lots of very nasty epithets applied to, for example, Representative Tim Scott, or Senator Tim Scott, recently, for speaking out against this stuff. And so you have this idea that you only count as diversity if you have the identity category and you have the authentic expression of that identity category as given by the relevant critical theory. And so what diversity means is commissars. It means commissars and apparatchiks. It means people who are ideologically consistent get places within, whether it's administrations, whether it's jobs, whether it's representation, whether it's speaking positions, positions of power and influence. In fact, influence is the main thing that they're after, power and influence. Okay, and so it is the installation of ideologically friendly characters. Inclusion, on the other hand, it basically means speech codes at the very simplest level, because an inclusive space is one where anybody who's deemed to be the oppressed by some system of power should never be made to feel uncomfortable. If they ever feel uncomfortable, or if anybody thinks on their behalf that they might be made uncomfortable by something that's happening there, it's not inclusive. And so what that justifies is the removal of people who do not have the ideologically pure views. And so you can kind of see how this creates a Sovietization. So diversity and inclusion are a Sovietization project, and equity is the goal of that project, which is to create something that looks very communistic by redistributing resources. Just to give you an extreme example that's commonplace, but it's within inclusion. One of the beliefs that they have in critical race theory is that the entire society is imbued with a white racial frame. That's your white supremacist superstructure. And that the white power structure, whiteness, is always present. And so what you actually have to do to give people of color, but particularly black people, a way to get away from that power structure is to create segregated spaces where only people of color or only black people are allowed. So if you see these movements for kind of this neo-segregation that's happening at almost, I don't know, untold numbers of colleges and universities, sometimes companies, etc., that's being done under the guise of inclusion. So you're literally excluding white people, for example, or white adjacent people, ideologically impure people who uphold white values, as they might say, white supremacy culture, as it was phrased in the thing from the Smithsonian National African American History Museum, or in the educational materials we referenced in the West Coast. They literally will have to exclude those people so that the people of color in that segregated space can get relief from the constant omnipresent white supremacist superstructure that they have to live in and that's imposed upon them at all other times. So inclusion justifies exclusion and literal segregation. And the reason is that it makes people allegedly feel not included to have to deal with even more whiteness in their lives. But if you take that past its kind of simple segregationist level, the next step beyond that is, well, you have to start removing people from the, say, institution or university altogether if they perpetuate white supremacy or uphold white supremacy culture or create this culture of white supremacy or maintain the white racial frame or whatever it happens to be. And so you have this justification to actually start purging. So you have, with diversity, install commissars. With inclusion, you have purge dissidents, and equity becomes the project. So diversity, equity, inclusion are actually the Sovietization of whatever takes them up.
Okay, so everything we've talked about so far has been sufficiently depressing and kind of sad. So let's talk about solutions for a minute. So try to end on a more positive note. So this year, Idaho passed two significant pieces of legislation. The first was a budget bill that basically penalized universities around $3 million for their social justice activism. And then the second one is a bill that bans universities and schools from compelling students to adopt certain divisive tenets of critical race theory. I would love to get your honest opinion of these kinds of proposals. You know, Idaho will have another chance next year if the universities don't change to penalize them again. Do you think they should do that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, in fact, what we're dealing with are people who are not amenable to reason. They're not amenable to the argument. They're not amenable to evidence. In fact, they explicitly say that deferring to those things or appealing to those things upholds white supremacy culture. They say that in the educational materials across the West Coast that are meant to be national. They say that in the National History Museum thing that I mentioned a minute ago from the Smithsonian. They genuinely believe this, that saying, oh, well, where's the evidence, or what does the evidence say, et cetera. What is the, you know, we're going to rely on reason and arguments. If you read in the Introduction to Critical Race Theory, the book called Critical Race Theory Introduction, I should say, the first paragraph even says that the things that they call the very foundations of into question are the liberal order, equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism. So there's your reason and evidence, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. So critical race theory actually calls into question, which is to say really rejects reliance upon those things, except when they are to their benefit. So if you can't reason, you can't present evidence, you can't discuss, you can't argue. If you try to invite them to a debate, they say that that's set up to uphold the white racial frame. Debates are held in the white racial frame. Evidence is part of the white racial frame. You're just excluding other perspectives. What you come down to, and this is of course consistent with both neo-Marxist and postmodern analysis, is that what they're interested in and the way they think is only about obtaining and applying power. And if they live in a world where the only thing that there is power, the only thing that you can do is apply power. And so while I don't think that we should apply force, applying every legal means to limit their access and ability to manipulate and seize power, I think is necessary. So taking away their ability to fund themselves if they're going to do this, prohibiting these bills that are banning the teaching of critical race theory, for example, by the way, only uphold what's already in the Civil Rights Act. So prohibiting them from violating already existing law and reinforcing that with this new kind of bill and trying to make it as enforceable as possible by punishing, by taking away funding when it's violated or removing people from their positions when it's violated, I think are absolutely and unfortunately needed. They're necessary, because these people, you can't if you can't reason with them and you can't present arguments for them. And as a friend of mine recently said, he said, don't always try to appeal to people's better nature, because sometimes they don't have one. And if you can't appeal to their better nature because they believe that they are uniquely on the right side of history and everybody who opposes them is fundamentally evil and a racist, you can't appeal to their better nature because they think they're on the right side of that. So the only option at that point is you have to, of course, they get their freedom of conscience, they get their freedom of belief, they get to do what they want to do. They can believe, speak, write, read, whatever they want. That's all their right. But they don't have to, nobody gives them a constitutional right to be in charge of a school. Take it away from them. They have to be removed from positions of power, which they are abusing in violation of existing law, which they understand that if they can subvert far enough or create precedent around, that the law is just a piece of paper. So you have to press back on them, and you have to press back on them with firm legal means and lots of public pressure, lots of exposure. So solutions look like exposure, pushing these kinds of bills, demanding enforcement with actual consequences for the violation. And it's all unfortunate. It's all a waste, but it's all also necessary, because their logic demands that this is the only thing that they know how to respond to is applications of power. And watch them howl. They say a hit dog will holler here down in the South. Well, watch them howl when you try to take them out of a position of power. You can see, for example, what happened with Allison Collins in San Francisco when she engaged in overt anti-Asian racism repeatedly, demonstrably over a course of many years, including calling them the N-word publicly. And then she finally gets under tremendous pressure. It required so much work to remove her from the San Francisco School Board, and she's only actually technically removed from her authority. She's technically still part of the board, if I'm not mistaken. And she went absolutely berserk. So months of fighting this, and now she's trying to sue the entire school board, which she knows is cash deprived, for something in excess of $87 million. A hit dog will holler. You take them out of power, they lose their freaking marbles. And that's proof that they think only in terms of power. And unfortunately, when you have people who are willing to abuse power in excess of the law, who have obtained it, the only option is to actually remove them from power and to remove their ability to continue to abuse their power.
I couldn't agree more. I think the misuse of public funds for things like social justice activism at universities is a total betrayal of the public's trust. Another way to look at this problem is recent events that occurred in North Carolina at UNC Chapel Hill. So UNC Chapel Hill recently hired Nicole Hannah-Jones, author of the 1619 Project, as a journalism professor. And the North Carolina's Board of Regents, I believe, recently announced that they're denying Nicole Hannah-Jones tenure. So do you think, a lot of people are criticizing this as an attack on academic freedom. Do you think this was a blow to academic freedom? Do you think this was the right thing for the Board of Regents to do? And what kind of standards of conduct do you think that an academic should be subject to, both professionally and politically in the university system?
What part of academic freedom says that somebody should be granted tenure? I don't recall that being part of. She can write whatever she wants. What part of academic freedom says that she should have a post at the New York Times? It's not academic freedom. These people are liars. I don't know another way to put it. They're just liars. This is academic freedom. Giving somebody a tenure position is now academic freedom? Just no, this isn't how any of this works. There's no violation of academic freedom here. There was a decision that was made that says she is still part of the faculty, that she's just not going to be granted immediate tenure in suspension of the usual rules of obtaining tenure. So she no longer gets special treatment. She's not being given this kind of gravy position that she doesn't deserve. And somehow they're going to frame this out as a denial of academic freedom. Of course, they do that. Excuse me. They're doing the same thing with these bills that restrict the teaching of the divisive concepts, which don't, by the way, usually ban critical race theory specifically. They ban doing certain things like racially scapegoating and discriminating, racially stereotyping, saying that the United States or the state of Idaho or whatever other state is intrinsically a racist organization or institution or polity or whatever. They ban teaching as fact certain divisive concepts, not critical race theory itself. And then at least the one that Trump put forth and several of the states copied is Trump's executive order last September, explicitly contains a section saying nothing in this will be construed to limit academic freedom. The teaching of critical race theory as an academic theory is still absolutely acceptable, blah, blah, blah. You just can't teach it as uncontested fact. You can't teach it as though it is anything other than a view within a particular theory that tries to understand. So there's no restriction of academic freedom occurring. That they claim that there is lying. The word for that is lying. It is telling falsehoods, probably very intentionally. And so I think that UNC has halfway made the right move. To be honest with you, I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones's employment prospects should be basically that she can freelance wherever anybody will publish her. I think that she should be actually I even told people at the New York Times before the 1619 Project thing blew up, before they had their whole like purging last summer, I told people at the New York Times that in my honest opinion, they'd put themselves in a trap with her in the 1619 Project. And the best move that they can make is to get rid of her before it goes any further. And so I think she should be removed from the New York Times Magazine. I think the New York Times should have done it years ago. I think that she shouldn't have anything to do with UNC. UNC humiliates itself by bringing Nicole Hannah-Jones in any regard. And if they want to grant her tenure, it's even more humiliating. And it's just more of another once, very respectable institution turning itself into what I would, with no sense of irony whatsoever, no exaggeration, call a clown college.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that UNC made the right decision in that case. And one thing we've talked about a lot at Idaho Freedom Foundation is one key to higher education reform in particular is to make sure that activists cannot secure careers in universities. They can work somewhere else. They need to go work somewhere else, but they can't work for our universities funded by our public dollars. So James, thank you so much.
Where's my job, right? Why don't I have tenure at like 10 universities? My academic freedom's under attack. Why isn't that a thing? Of course, because that's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, so we've been talking for an hour. I've used up a lot of your time. So for people that would like to explore this work more, for people that want to hear more from you, where should we send them?
I have a website, newdiscourses.com. The company is New Discourses, has as much information as I can publish as fast as I can publish it. Pardon the typos. I don't even usually proofread properly because I want to get it out as fast as possible and go on to the next thing about this ideology. I'm writing an encyclopedia of how they misuse terminology so you can understand what they mean when they use their tricky words. It's there on New Discourses. So check out the website, New Discourses. You can follow the company, New Discourses, at New Discourses on almost all the social media platforms. I am at Conceptual James on most social media platforms, and you can follow me personally there. I am not everybody's cup of tea, but I think I'm fun. So you're welcome to follow me on social media wherever you can find me.
I can attest to that. James is really fun to follow on social media. Definitely suggest following him. And I also suggest reading Cynical Theories. It's so good, as you can see by all of the tabs on this book. I've read it a lot. I've read it about 3 times, the whole thing. Really important book. So go buy that book on Amazon, read it, learn more. So James, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you for being here with us. And I hope everyone on this call has a great day.
Yep. Thank you.